I will call myself a Christian, so I'm familiar with the teachings of Christianity. Since the Bible includes the Old Testament and the New Testament, I'm more or less familiar with Judaism. The only religion that I'm not super familiar with is Islam. So for the month of June, I've decided to read the Quran every day for maybe 10 to 15 minutes each day and share my thoughts on what I've read. I have no prior experience reading the Quran. I'll also try not to look up any information online. I want to share my uninfluenced thoughts, which means that I will probably interpret things potentially wrong. I just want to share my most honest and uninfluenced thoughts on what I've read. So let's begin. Let's start with day 1. This is day 1 of reading the Quran. I started with the chapter called Mary because I want to see what the Quran says about Jesus, and I thought that this would probably be the chapter to do so. I have this version, the Penguin Classic version. I'm not sure if the Quran has multiple translations as with the Bible, but this is what I placed on hold in the library, and this is what I got, so I'll be reading this version if there are multiple versions. Right away I know that it's divided maybe similar to the Bible, but I'm not sure. So for Mary, it starts with 19:1. I know 19 is the chapter, but I'm not sure about the second number. I thought it was maybe the sentence number, but I counted it and that didn't match up. So I'm not exactly sure what it's referring to. Maybe it's the verses in the original text. One of the first things I noticed while I was reading it was that it made a reference to the Bible. It referenced Luke 1:61 during the part where it talked about Zacharias having a son named John, and that was a name that was given to no other man before him. So I cross-referenced it. I opened up the Bible to Luke 1:61, and this is what it says in the ESV version. And they said to her, "None of your relatives is called by this name." In the Quran, the father of John, Zacharias, is spelled with an S, but in the Bible it's spelled with an H. I think that is probably just a translation difference. And then it goes in to talk about Mary, the mother of Jesus. I think the story of how she gave birth to Jesus is consistent with the Bible. It says that she was basically a virgin, and that, or specifically it says, she had not been touched by any man, nor ever been unchaste. But then something weird happens, which is when Mary points to baby Jesus in the cradle, and it seems like baby Jesus started talking, and he says, "I am the servant of God. He has given me the book and ordained me a prophet." I have heard that the Islamic religion believes the existence of Jesus, but not believe that he was the Son of God. They believe that he's a prophet like many other prophets who have lived before him. In this chapter, I noticed that there are a lot of references to biblical figures, people like Abraham, Noah, as well as other biblical themes like the Garden of Eden. I also noticed that mercy or merciful is one of the adjectives that is used a lot to describe God. There's a lot of phrases like Lord of Mercy or the Merciful One, and I think that's interesting. I'm not sure if it's just this chapter specifically or if this is an overall repetition in the Quran. I'll have to read more to find out. One thing that really stood out was towards the last part of this chapter. For this book, it's on page 208. And for the specific part, I guess I could say 19:88, it states, "And they said, the Lord of mercy has begotten a son. You surely preach a monstrous falsehood, at which the very heavens might crack, the earth split asunder, and the mountains crumble to dust. That they should ascribe a son to the merciful, when it does not become the merciful to beget offspring." So I think this part is a direct attack on Christianity and saying that what Christianity preaches is not correct, which makes me think, what were some of the teachings of Jesus as a prophet according to Islam, and what things did he teach? I want to know more of that. Day 2 of reading the Quran. Today I read the chapter called Joseph. I think I'll probably start with figures that I recognize because I want to see how it compares to the Bible. One observation I noticed is that in the beginning of every chapter after the chapter name, there's this heading that says, "In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate." One question I do have is who is speaking? The passages use a lot of pronouns such as we or our, and I'm not sure who they're referring to. In this chapter, the beginning of the story of Joseph was pretty consistent with the Bible's account. Joseph was sold by his brothers and left in a pit and was found by a caravan. Joseph eventually makes his way to Egypt, and he maneuvers his way into a top-ranking official of the Egyptian government. Then Joseph was seduced by a woman that the Quran says other people in the city called the prince's wife. In the Bible, it's slightly different. The woman that seduced him was a wife to the officer of the Pharaoh. Here's where the account becomes different. In the Bible, it seems like Joseph was immediately thrown in jail after being accused of sleeping with the officer's wife. But in the Quran, it seems like the officer or the husband to the woman knew that it was the woman's fault and not Joseph's fault. But eventually Joseph gets thrown in jail as well. The overall story is pretty similar. Joseph interprets two people's dreams while he was in prison, and one person lived while the other was killed. Joseph told the person that lived to mention his name to the Pharaoh, but that person forgot and only remembered later on in the story when the Pharaoh has his own dreams and was unable to interpret them. There are probably minor differences, but I'm not going to get into it. Another more significant difference is that the woman who seduced Joseph later on admitted that she was the one at fault and that she made up all of those accusations against Joseph. Day 3 of reading the Quran. Today I read the book of Jonah, and I was surprised to find that Jonah didn't really make an appearance. He was mentioned towards the end of this chapter, but aside from that, he was not talked about much. I thought that I would get the story about Jonah getting swallowed up by a big fish. I was hoping to compare the biblical account to the Quran's account, but this was not what the chapter was about. There were mentions of other major biblical figures like Noah, Abraham, and Aaron. Not a whole lot, but maybe a passage dedicated to them. There's a big emphasis on believing and doing good works. For those that believe and do good works, they will be rewarded in the afterlife, but those that do not believe will be punished. The phrase "the straight path" has also been mentioned several times in this chapter, as well as maybe in previous chapters I've read. I'm not exactly sure what those are referring to. I think that based on this chapter, the pronouns we or our refers to God, but I'm still not certain. Another phrase that I have seen repeated is the day of resurrection. Not exactly sure what this day entails and when it's supposed to happen. Maybe I will learn more about it later on in other chapters. Day 5. I decided that I would take Sundays off, so day 4 was a day of rest. Instead of numbering the days by the day in which I read the Quran, I'll just go by the calendar day. So that's why today is day 5, but it's actually day 4 of reading the Quran. Today I read the chapters Abraham and Noah. They're both relatively short passages, so I decided to do both. I'm surprised I didn't catch the chapter of Abraham before this, which is why I started with the other chapters. I think after today I've gone through all the chapters that are titled with biblical figures. The chapter of Abraham actually begins with the story of Moses and how his people were being treated cruelly and harshly by the Egyptians. Around 14:6, the Quran says that the Pharaoh's nation remember God's goodness to you when he delivered you from Pharaoh's nation, who had oppressed you cruelly, slaughtering your sons and sparing only your daughters. This part differed from the Bible's version. In Exodus 1, the king of Egypt did make a commandment that sons should be killed and daughters could be left to live. But the midwives didn't obey their king because they feared the Lord. Therefore the people grew and multiplied, and the midwives were also blessed with families. So that's the difference between the Quran and the Bible, relating to the same figure and the same event. For the rest of this chapter, there's a huge emphasis on believing and prayer, and there's also this threat of not believing, so unbelievers will be punished harshly. They will be condemned to hell. Essentially, they will be tortured, and one specific part says, "Death will assail him from every side, yet shall he not be dead." So very scary things for those that don't believe. In the chapter of Noah, one sentence said that God created the 7 heavens. I'm not sure what that is referring to. Is it other planets? Is it other galaxies? I'm not sure. In verse 25, it says that they were drowned and cast into the fire. But there were no details of who was drowned. Was it everyone besides Noah's family? I would say that this account of Noah is less detailed than the Bible's account. There was no mention of the ark. There is no mention of bringing 2 of each animal into the ark. There was no mention of the names of the sons of Noah. The only thing that was mentioned was that believers were saved and those that did not believe were killed.